My name was dragged through the mud by the very people who should have known me best. For months, my younger sister spun lies about me, claims so outrageous and calculated that they turned my own parents against me. She whispered poison into their ears until they no longer looked me in the eye. I was treated like a criminal at my own family's dinner table, accused of things I never said, never did. Every protest I made was twisted back at me, as if defending myself proved guilt. I wasn't just losing my family, I was losing my reputation, my job, and the fragile trust I had built in my community. The worst part? My parents didn't even ask for proof. They believed her word over mine, unquestioned. But lies, no matter how carefully crafted, can't survive under the cold light of evidence. And the day that courtroom tape was played, every mask she wore cracked, and my family had no choice but to face the truth. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 32 years old, male, and I work as a data analyst for a logistics firm in Westbridge, a mid-sized city tucked between two interstates. On most days, my life is defined by numbers, patterns, and records, cold, impartial things that make sense when people don't. I've always taken comfort in them, maybe because people in my family have never made much sense to me. The reason I'm telling this story now is because numbers and records were the only things that saved me. My own words meant nothing, not to my parents, not to my sister, not even to my colleagues once whispers started circulating. The only reason I still have a job, a roof, and the thin thread of dignity left is because the truth left a trail, and I was stubborn enough to follow it. I grew up the eldest of two children. My sister, Hannah, is 5 years younger than me. She was the golden child, the one who always knew how to draw attention. If she wanted something, she'd smile, tilt her head, and my parents bent. I never resented her for it when we were kids, I thought that's just how families worked. But as adults, those habits hardened into something else, something darker. Before all this started, my life was simple. I worked 9 to 5 shifts, came home to my one-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city, and spent my evenings reading or fixing up my old Honda Civic. Nothing remarkable, nothing scandalous. Then Hannah made a claim that pulled me into a storm I couldn't have predicted. It started small, a story she told my parents late one evening, when I wasn't there to defend myself. By the time I even heard what she had said, the atmosphere in my parents' kitchen had already shifted. My father's eyes no longer met mine. My mother's hands, once warm when she hugged me, stayed folded in front of her chest. They didn't ask. They didn't want an explanation. They believed her. That was the night I realized, blood doesn't always recognize truth. The first accusation came to me secondhand. I was driving home from work when my mother called, her voice clipped and brittle, the kind of tone she used when she was both angry and disappointed. She didn't even say hello. "Why would you do that to your sister, Daniel?" I remember pulling into the gravel lot outside my building, phone pressed to my ear, completely blindsided. "Do what?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. I could hear dishes clattering in the background, the scrape of a chair. Then, softly but loaded, she said, "She told us everything." But she didn't tell me what everything was. She hung up after saying we'd talk at dinner on Sunday. The call ended with a click, and I sat in the car staring at my own reflection in the windshield, trying to figure out what I was being accused of. That Sunday, I drove to my parents' house, an aging split level on Brookfield Lane that still smelled faintly of the lemon polish my mother used religiously on the banisters. The air was thick with tension before I even set foot inside. Hannah was already there, sitting at the table, her hands folded primly in front of her like she was giving testimony in church. My father's face was stone. My mother's lips were pressed tight. Finally, Hannah spoke. "I told them what you said to me last week. About covering up that missing money." My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 weeks, and there was no missing money in my life. She looked at me with wide, earnest eyes as if she were the victim. "You think I'd steal from my own office?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I wanted. "You said it yourself, Dan," she shot back. "You told me you moved numbers around at work so no one would notice. That's embezzlement." The word rang out in the kitchen like a gavel. My parents shifted in their chairs. My father cleared his throat, but he didn't defend me. The thing about lies is they don't need to be plausible. They just need to sound close enough to the truth for people who already want to believe them. My job was numbers. I did move them around, though not the way she was implying. I adjusted spreadsheets, reconciled invoices, caught discrepancies before they became problems. Hannah twisted that into something criminal. That night, I tried to explain, but every word I said felt like it sank deeper into quicksand. My parents nodded politely, but their eyes were already poisoned. The more I defended myself, the guiltier I sounded. When I left their house, I could still hear Hannah's voice echoing, embezzlement. It would not be the last time she used that word. After that dinner, something in my parents' house changed. I used to stop by once a week, usually on Sundays, to share a meal and help my dad with whatever project he was tinkering on: leaky gutters, the garage door opener, the endless battle with weeds in the driveway cracks. But now, when I walked through their front door, the warmth I had always counted on was gone. My mother no longer greeted me with her usual hug. Instead, she offered a polite smile, brittle and quick, like she was bracing herself for contamination. My father, who once talked to me about his day with quiet pride, now kept his answers clipped and neutral, as though anything more might reveal an uncomfortable truth he was unwilling to face. It wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't. Silence had moved in between us, thick and suffocating. The worst part was the small details. My old high school trophies, once displayed on a shelf in the living room alongside Hannah's, were boxed away in the basement. The framed photo of me at my college graduation was replaced with one of Hannah at her art exhibit. My father didn't ask for my help fixing the gutters that month. Instead, I saw him on a ladder when I drove past, alone and wobbling, as if it were better to risk falling than to ask me. At work, I felt the shift too. Logistics isn't glamorous, but it runs on trust. One rumor, embezzlement, was enough to make people pause when I entered a meeting room. A colleague I'd worked with for 5 years, Mark, stopped leaving his coffee mug at my desk when we collaborated on reports. I caught him once pulling a file off the printer that had my name on it, reading it longer than necessary, as if it might contain proof. All this while, Hannah never confronted me directly. She didn't need to. She spoke to my parents in quiet conversations, carefully timed when I wasn't there. She reached out to relatives with concerns. My aunt called me one night asking if I was okay, her voice loaded with pity. That's how I knew the poison was spreading further than my parents' kitchen. The home I grew up in had become hostile ground, and my family, the one place I should have found safety, was now the front line of suspicion. I started keeping my visits short. 10 minutes at most. Enough to show I wasn't avoiding them, but not long enough to endure the coldness. I stopped eating Sunday dinners altogether. My parents never asked why. That was the moment I realized Hannah wasn't just lying. She was isolating me. She wanted me cornered, friendless, and doubted. And for the first time in my life, I began to wonder if she might succeed. Lies have a way of snowballing. What started as Hannah's whisper about missing money didn't stay confined to my parents' house. Within weeks, it took on new shapes, sharper edges, and longer shadows. I first noticed it when a neighbor, Mrs. Klein, stopped me outside my apartment complex. She'd known me since I was 12, since the days I mowed her lawn for a couple of bucks. Normally, she was warm and chatty. That day, her smile was strained, her words careful. "I hope you're sorting things out," she said, eyes flicking away. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. But I knew exactly who had spoken to her. Hannah was seeding stories in the community. At first, it was about me fudging numbers at work. Then it was me borrowing money from people and not paying it back. By the time the third version reached me, through a cousin at a family gathering, it had escalated to me having serious gambling debts. None of it was true. But each lie had just enough plausibility to stick. I did work with money. I did keep to myself. And since I wasn't constantly defending myself to every passing acquaintance, people filled the silence with assumption. Work became unbearable. I'd walk into the break room and hear conversations pause. My boss, a pragmatic man named Keller, called me into his office one Friday afternoon. He didn't accuse me directly, but he asked pointedly if everything was in order with my accounts. I showed him records, reconciled statements, clean as a whistle. He nodded, but I could tell, once suspicion creeps in, proof isn't enough to erase it. At home, the isolation thickened. My calls to my parents went unanswered more often than not. When I did manage to speak with them, the conversations were clipped, dominated by awkward silences. My father asked me once if I needed help, the kind of help reserved for someone with a secret addiction. I told him no, but the look he gave me said he didn't believe it. The most cutting moment came at my cousin Aaron's engagement party. I walked in with a small gift, wrapped neatly in silver paper, and felt eyes on me as if I were an intruder. Hannah was already there, dressed immaculately in a red dress, her voice carrying across the room as she laughed and leaned into conversations. I caught the end of one sentence as I approached, and of course, I don't want to say too much, but you can imagine what it's like for us, having to deal with him. She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. Heads turned toward me as I entered, and the silence that followed was louder than any accusation. That night, driving home along the interstate, I gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. The lies weren't just words anymore, they were shaping my reality. My family was drifting further, my reputation was collapsing, and Hannah stood at the center of it all, unchallenged. I realized then, if I didn't start pushing back, she was going to erase me completely. When someone lies often enough, they start leaving trails, loose ends, contradictions, tiny slips they think no one notices. By the time Hannah's stories had fully infected my family and coworkers, I realized the only way out was to treat this like what it was, an investigation. The first break came by accident. I was at my parents' house one evening, trying for the 100th time to explain myself, when Hannah mentioned I'd confessed to her over coffee at Bay Street Cafe. That stopped me cold. I'd never been to Bay Street Cafe in my life. I knew it was on the other side of town, near the courthouse, but I had no reason to go there. I didn't even know what it looked like inside. I didn't argue in the moment, I'd learned arguing only made me look defensive. But as soon as I left, I checked my bank statements. No transactions from Bay Street Cafe. No debit card swipe, no cash withdrawal near that date. The trail was clean. That night, I began pulling records, bank statements, email logs, even the time-stamped access card entries from work that showed exactly when I entered and exited the building. If Hannah claimed I met her somewhere at a specific time, I wanted to know exactly where I actually was. The second inconsistency came through my cousin Erin. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Hannah told her I had asked to borrow money on the night of Erin's engagement party. The absurdity of it made me laugh bitterly. I had brought a wrapped gift that night, which Erin herself had opened. That gift was purchased with my debit card 3 days prior. I pulled the receipt from my email. Another hole in Hannah's story. But it wasn't enough to know she was lying. I needed something undeniable, something my parents couldn't wave away as misunderstanding. That's when I thought of recordings. I didn't want to cross into illegality, so I researched what the state allowed. It turned out that in West Bridges jurisdiction, one-party consent recordings were lawful. That meant I could record any conversation I was part of without needing her permission. The next time Hannah cornered me, I'd be ready. In the meantime, I built a small binder. Every receipt, every email, every discrepancy went in. A page from my work log here, a time-stamped message there. I even printed out the directory of Bay Street Cafe to highlight the fact that I had never used their Wi-Fi, something that would have been recorded if I'd actually been there. Each piece on its own was trivial. But together, they started forming a picture. Hannah wasn't just embellishing. She was manufacturing entire scenarios from nothing. For the first time in months, I felt a thin spark of control return. She had the charm, the family's ear, the sympathy, but I had something harder, evidence. And I was just getting started. By the time I began collecting evidence, the weight of Hannah's lies had already reshaped my daily life. Every routine, work, errands, family contact, was now measured against the constant hum of suspicion. It was like living under a low ceiling that kept pressing downward, a pressure cooker with no release valve. At work, the tension grew sharper. My boss Keller asked me to undergo a standard audit of my accounts. I knew it wasn't standard. In 5 years at the firm, I'd never heard of anyone being randomly audited unless someone raised a concern. I smiled, nodded, and handed over everything. It took 3 weeks for the auditors to clear me, and in that time, colleagues looked at me like a ticking bomb that might go off in their spreadsheets. Outside of work, the damage was worse. Family gatherings became unbearable. My parents kept inviting Hannah but not me. When I did show up, forcing the issue, conversations fell flat, and I could feel eyes flicking between us like we were two competing witnesses. Once, when I tried to joke with my mother the way I used to, Hannah interrupted with a soft, pitying laugh. "He always does this when he's nervous," she said, as if narrating my behavior for everyone else. My mother smiled weakly, as though Hannah's version of me was the real one. Even friends began pulling away. A poker night I'd been part of for years quietly dissolved without anyone telling me why. I only found out later, through a mutual acquaintance, that someone had told them I was borrowing money to cover losses. That was never true. But once a rumor like that touches your name, people don't ask questions. They just retreat. Sleep became difficult. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling fan in my apartment, its slow rotations ticking off the hours I wasn't resting. My phone stayed beside me on the nightstand, not for comfort but for defense. Every vibration made me brace for the next accusation, the next blow to whatever reputation I still had left. The binder of evidence was the only thing that steadied me. Each new piece of proof I added, receipts, bank logs, emails, felt like stacking a brick against the flood. But I also knew that collecting wasn't enough. I'd need a decisive moment, a crack in Hannah's armor, something undeniable to make everyone see her for what she was. The pressure was building on both sides. Hannah was weaving a bigger net of lies, and I was quietly constructing my defense. It was only a matter of time before the two collided. And when they did, one of us wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The more Hannah lied, the more I realized that words wouldn't save me. She could twist any conversation, reframe any denial, and spin it back against me. If I was going to beat her, it wouldn't be through argument. It would be through records, cold, impartial, time-stamped facts. I started with what I already had, my work access logs. Every time I swiped my badge to enter or exit the building, it left a digital trail. I filed a request with HR for my personal access history for the last 3 months. They hesitated, but under company policy, employees were entitled to their own records. When I got the report, it was 32 pages long, each line stamped with time, date, and door number. Cross-referencing those entries with Hannah's claims was like watching her web unravel in real time. On the night she said I was at Bay Street Cafe confessing embezzlement, my badge recorded me entering the office at 7:12 p.m. and leaving at 10:47 p.m. The system even logged that I accessed the secure records room twice that evening. I highlighted those entries, slid them into the binder, and felt the weight shift slightly in my favor. Next, I pulled my phone records. My carrier's online portal provided a detailed log of calls and texts, each with a timestamp. Hannah had told our parents that I'd called her late at night begging for cash. According to my records, I hadn't called or texted her once in that entire month. Another contradiction, another page in the binder. I also began filing quiet requests for public records. Court filings, property records, anything that could show Hannah's financial situation. If she was accusing me of money problems, I wanted to know if projection was at play. Buried in county filings, I found that she had maxed out 2 credit cards and was being sued for default on a personal loan. That discovery didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how neatly her accusations against me mirrored her own hidden troubles. Finally, I bought a small voice recorder, something discreet that I could carry in my pocket. Westbridge was a one-party consent state. If I was present for the conversation, I could legally record it. From that point on, any time I met Hannah, the recorder was rolling. The first few tapes yielded nothing but pleasantries, the kind she performed so well. But eventually, I knew, she'd slip. A liar always does. Every document, every log, every recording found its place in the binder. I kept it organized like evidence in a case file, labeled by date and subject. It wasn't just for me anymore, it was preparation for a day I felt certain would come. A day when all of this wouldn't just be whispered rumors, but testimony under oath. I wasn't chasing vindication in my parents' eyes anymore. I was preparing for something bigger. Something permanent. For weeks, I carried the recorder like a second skin. Every family dinner, every accidental run-in, every forced conversation, I hit the red button and let it run. At first, all I caught were Hannah's polished performances, cheerful small talk, subtle digs at my stress levels, carefully constructed lines designed to paint me as unstable. It was infuriating, but not useful. Then came the night everything shifted. It was late September. My parents had asked me over under the pretense of trying to move forward. I arrived to find Hannah already seated at the kitchen table, a mug of tea in her hand, looking for all the world like she belonged there more than I did. The conversation started civil, but it didn't take long for her to start weaving again. She leaned toward my parents and said, "It just breaks my heart to see Dan lying to you both. If he would just admit he took that money, we could finally heal." My father's jaw tightened. My mother shook her head in quiet sorrow. I kept my voice even. "What money, Hannah?" She looked at me with that feigned innocence she wore so well. "The 10,000 you told me about. The money you said you had to hide before your office audit." 10,000. A specific number. My pulse quickened. "Funny," I said, forcing calm, "because the auditors finished last week and cleared me completely. No missing funds. Would you like to see the report?" Her smile faltered, just for a flicker. Then she recovered. "Of course they cleared you. You're good at hiding things." And then, almost like she couldn't help herself, she slipped. "You think I don't know how to move numbers around too? You think I don't know how to cover tracks?" The room went silent. My parents blinked, confused. I didn't react outwardly, but inside, I felt the weight of the recorder in my pocket like a live wire. Her words were captured, her admission, her projection, her entire lie entangled in that one careless outburst. I let the conversation die there, not pressing further. The more I pushed, the more she might sense what I was doing. Instead, I excused myself early, drove home, and replayed the recording 3 times at my desk. Each playback tightened the knot of certainty in my chest. That was the crack I'd been waiting for. Up until then, everything I had collected was circumstantial: logs, receipts, records. They painted a picture, but pictures can be doubted. This was different. This was Hannah, in her own voice, admitting to the very thing she accused me of. It wasn't the end of the war, but it was the first decisive victory. And with it, the binder transformed. It wasn't just a defense anymore. It was ammunition. For the first time in months, I felt the pressure ease. I didn't just hope Hannah would slip again. I knew she would. And the next time, I'd be ready to make sure she couldn't escape. After the breakthrough recording, I stopped thinking of myself as a victim of Hannah's lies. I began thinking like a prosecutor preparing a case. If she could spin stories in kitchens and living rooms, then I needed an arena where spin didn't matter, where records, timestamps, and evidence carried the weight. That meant court. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One of Hannah's creditors filed suit against her over her unpaid loan. When I discovered the case in the county docket, I knew it was the opening I needed. She'd be under oath, speaking in a courtroom where every word would be recorded. If I could position the evidence correctly, her own contradictions would surface. I contacted a lawyer, someone low profile, recommended by a colleague who had dealt with a family probate dispute. Her name was Rachel Lynn, meticulous and unflappable, the kind of person who didn't waste words. I handed her the binder, every receipt and record organized by date. She spent 2 hours flipping through it, occasionally nodding but saying little. When she finally closed it, she looked me in the eye and said, "This isn't just defense material. This is strategy. If she testifies, we can dismantle her credibility in minutes." Together, we prepared. Rachel coached me on restraint, how not to take Hannah's bait in the courtroom, how to answer questions with precision, how to let silence work in my favor. More importantly, she prepared motions to introduce my recordings as evidence, each properly logged with chain of custody. Meanwhile, I set one last trap. I invited Hannah to meet me under the guise of resolving things privately. We met at a quiet cafe, not Bay Street, but a different place, one I deliberately chose because the CCTV cameras were visible above the counter. As the recorder ran in my pocket, I asked her why she kept saying I'd confessed to crimes I didn't commit. Her answer was exactly what I hoped for. She laughed, leaned forward, and said, "Because they believe me, Dan. They always have. You can wave receipts around all you want, but Mom and Dad will never take your side over mine." That single sentence sealed it. She wasn't just lying. She was admitting she knew she was lying, relying on blind trust to shield her. I walked out of that cafe with the tape and the security footage timestamp to back it up. 2 converging pieces of evidence, her voice and the camera proving she was there, saying it. Rachel filed the motion to introduce both at the upcoming hearing. For weeks, I felt like I was holding my breath underwater, waiting for the date to arrive. When it did, I walked into the courtroom with my binder under one arm, the recorder in my pocket, and Rachel at my side. Hannah sat across the aisle, confident as ever, dressed like she was there for a performance. My parents sat behind her, faces hard, eyes refusing to meet mine. She thought she was walking into another stage to play her role. But this time, the audience was the law. And the law had tape. Courtrooms have a strange quiet, a kind of heavy silence that makes every cough, every shuffle of paper sound like a thunderclap. On the morning of Hannah's hearing, that silence pressed down on me like weight. She sat at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer, smiling faintly as though this were just another performance she'd win by charm alone. My parents were in the gallery, their expressions carved from stone. They hadn't spoken to me in weeks. When Hannah took the stand, her voice was steady, practiced. She spoke of debts she claimed weren't her fault, of how she'd been misled and taken advantage of. Then, as if rehearsed, she pivoted. She wove me into her testimony, suggesting that my financial recklessness was part of why she struggled. It was all implication, never directly accusing me of a crime, but planting the seeds. Rachel waited until cross-examination. She moved slowly, methodically, drawing Hannah into repeating key points. Each time Hannah added a detail, Rachel pressed for specifics, dates, amounts, locations. And each time, Hannah grew bolder, more confident, because she believed she was in control. Then Rachel glanced at the judge and said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to introduce a recording relevant to the witness's credibility." The judge nodded. A bailiff wheeled in the small speaker system. My pulse hammered as Rachel cued the file. First came the cafe conversation. Hannah's voice, clear and sharp, "Because they believe me, Dan. They always have. You can wave receipts around all you want, but Mom and Dad will never take your side over mine. The courtroom stilled. My parents shifted in their seats. Hannah's face drained of color. Then Rachel played the earlier recording, the one from my parents' kitchen. You think I don't know how to move numbers around too? You think I don't know how to cover tracks? The words rang through the room like a crack of lightning. On the record. In her own voice. Hannah stammered on the stand, trying to backtrack, but Rachel pressed gently. So when you said you know how to cover tracks, you weren't referring to the defendant. You were referring to yourself? Hannah's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The judge overruled, and Hannah, cornered, tried to spin. Her words tangled, contradicted her earlier testimony, and Rachel calmly highlighted each discrepancy with timestamps, receipts, and logs from my binder. By the time cross-examination ended, Hannah wasn't smiling anymore. She sat rigid in her chair, eyes darting toward our parents as though they could rescue her. But they didn't move. When the judge adjourned for the day, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow, like air rushing out of a room after a long storm. The lies had collapsed, the recordings had done their work, but the cost was written all over my parents' faces. They looked at Hannah with shock, then at me with something worse, shame. For the first time in months, the truth was undeniable. But vindication didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. The aftermath of the hearing spread faster than I expected. Court records are public, and in Westbridge, local reporters scan filings for stories worth printing. Within a week, the Westbridge Gazette ran a short piece, "Plaintiff discredited by courtroom audio, lone case collapses." It wasn't front-page news, but it was there, in black and white, Hannah's credibility shredded by her own words. At work, the change was immediate. Keller called me into his office, not for another audit, but to apologize. He admitted, stiffly, that he had allowed outside chatter to color his view. He didn't say Hannah's name, but he didn't have to. For the first time in months, I walked back to my desk without feeling eyes burning into my back. The suspicion had broken. In the community, the silence around me shifted. Mrs. Klein stopped me outside the apartments again, this time with a warm loaf of banana bread wrapped in foil. She didn't mention the article, but the gesture said everything. She believed me now. The poker group texted to ask if I wanted to come back. Slowly, the walls Hannah built began to crumble. The hardest part was my parents. They didn't speak to me right away. I knew they were reckoning with the recordings, the evidence, the article. When my father finally called, it was a brief, halting conversation. "We heard the tape," he said. His voice was rough. "We should have asked questions sooner." That was all. He didn't say he was sorry, but I heard it in the silence that followed. Hannah, on the other hand, retreated. She stopped answering calls, stopped appearing at family gatherings. Word spread that she had moved out of her apartment in the city. Some said she was staying with a friend out of state. Others whispered about rehab. I didn't chase the details. For once, her absence brought peace. Rachel, ever practical, reminded me to keep every document, every recording. "Truth," she said, "needs an archive." I filed the binder away, not as a weapon anymore, but as a record of what happened, something undeniable if lies ever resurfaced. Public exposure didn't bring me triumph. It brought quiet correction. People who had looked at me with suspicion now looked at me with caution, even guilt. Trust, I realized, doesn't return overnight. But the truth had been aired, and that mattered more than anyone's apology. The town no longer whispered about me. They whispered about Hannah. And for the first time in nearly a year, I could breathe. In the weeks after the courtroom tape played, life didn't return to what it had been before. Too much had been broken for that. But it did settle into something steadier, something survivable. Work normalized. My reports were trusted again, my desk no longer a point of suspicion. I poured myself into projects, grateful for the rhythm of numbers, grateful for the way spreadsheets never lied. Family remained complicated. My parents reached out tentatively, phone calls first, then an invitation for dinner. Sitting at that table again felt strange, the same kitchen, the same lemon polish smell, but nothing was the same. They tried to speak as though things were normal, but the unspoken hung between us. They had believed Hannah without question, and I had been forced to prove my innocence like a stranger. Forgiveness was possible. Forgetting wasn't. As for Hannah, she disappeared from my daily life. Months passed without a word from her. No letters, no calls, no attempts to spin another story. In some ways, that silence was the greatest gift she ever gave me. I kept the binder. I couldn't throw it away. Every receipt, every log, every recording was still there, a record of what had nearly unraveled me. Sometimes I'd catch myself opening it late at night, flipping through the pages just to remind myself, I hadn't imagined it. It had happened, and I had survived it. People in town eventually stopped whispering. The story faded, replaced by new scandals, new gossip. But I never forgot the lesson: trust without evidence is a dangerous thing. On my last visit to my parents' house, I noticed something small but telling. In the living room, the shelf that once held only Hannah's photos now had mine again too. Not front and center, not as if nothing had happened, but there, acknowledged, visible. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had already done the work. As I left that night, stepping into the cool air, I paused at the end of the driveway and looked back. The house stood quiet, the porch light glowing softly. I realized then that justice doesn't come with applause or triumph. It comes with quiet, with accountability, with the weight finally lifted. And as I walked away, one line settled in my mind, final and unshakable. Lies may echo loudest in the beginning, but the truth always leaves the last sound.